The thing about Japanese subcultures is that it's a spectrum. On one end, you have subcultures like Lolita fashion or Morike that make you go, yeah, I can see that being a thing in Japan. But then you get to the really niche groups like Japanese cowboys or the Japanese Chicano scene that makes you go, how the f did this even get here? But the point of subcultures is that they give people a sense of community. As weird as it gets sometimes, that collective identity through fashion and aesthetic can be a really motivating feeling, especially for people that crave that sense of belonging. But this desire for an identity can also be very destructive. And you can see this in the Japanese subculture of Bosozoku. Bosozoku were Japanese biker gangs that used to terrorize the roadways of Japan. They blocked off highways, held mass rallies, and even clashed with the police in riots. And far from being just a couple of hundred people on bikes, the subculture would number up to around 42,000 people in 1982 alone, with the majority of those being teenagers. And what's funny is that Bosozoku didn't start out as a rebellious youth culture. It actually started with returning Japanese World War II veterans trying to readapt to civilian life. So that's what I wanted to explore. How did a movement by World War II veterans trying to move on from the war get co-opted by a bunch of delinquent teens? Why did said teens ride these crazy looking bikes? And to also show you guys just how common this subculture is in anime? And the answer is a lot more complicated than you think. So it's really important for me to mention that Bosozoku aren't really much of a thing nowadays. The subculture movement kind of died down in the late 90s and 2000s, with most people in Japan today considering them a retro relic of that era. Hell, there was even a Bosozoku gathering in 2020 that only ended up attracting 53 people, a far cry from that 42,000 number I mentioned earlier. This doesn't mean their story is any less relevant to more modern youth subcultures. While the Bosozoku dominated Japan in the 1970s and 80s, their origins lie in the 1950s, specifically with surviving Japanese World War II soldiers. After Japan's defeat, there were plenty of surviving soldiers that were left destitute and directionless, with the country busy rebuilding under American supervision and with their only relevant skill being that of murking other people. Tennoeiga! Banzai! There really weren't a lot of opportunities open to them. So to cope with, in their eyes, a rapidly changing Japan and to find an emotional outlet, a lot of them rallied around communities of fellow veterans with shared hobbies, one of them being motorcycles. And it's here the Kaminari Zoku, or Thunder Tribe, was born. These were men that found belonging on the saddle and at high speeds. They ran red lights, raced down city streets at blinding speeds, got chased by the police, all while trying to be as loud as they could, which is actually why they were called the Thunder Tribe, because of their habit of removing their mufflers from their bike, which, if you didn't know, makes them very, very loud. And while the Kaminari Zoku thought of themselves as rebels without a cause, trying to find freedom in a westernized Japan, most locals did in fact see them as a nuisance and a genuine societal problem, something that their successors, the Bosozoku, would inherit. But that's as far as their similarities would go, as both groups couldn't be any more different. As the OG Kaminari Zoku members got older and retired, the new younger members would fill up their ranks. And with this changing of the guard, the movement would shift radically, namely in fashion. Since the old guard of the Kaminari Zoku had more of a military background, their fashion reflected this. Rugged leather jackets and shades, biker goggles and helmets, and cuffed denim jeans for style. It was practical, rugged, and perfect for ex-military men with a need for speed. But unlike the old heads, the new generation of bikers wanted something more grand. So they phased out the leather jackets and jeans and instead chose the tokofuku, a type of custom-made jumpsuit that was embroidered with bright slogans and intricate imagery. And if they weren't wearing a helmet, they'd be wearing a hachimaki, which is a stylized bandana. And I haven't even mentioned the bikes. Long gone are the days of modded out Harleys or Indian bikes. By the 60s and 70s, Japan had re-established its motor industries. So bikes from brands like Yamaha were really easy to get and easy to modify, which is how you get bikes that look like this. But don't be mistaken, as gaudy as they were still the descendants of the Kaminari Zoku. They still raced through city streets, they still blocked off highways, and they still clashed with the police. It's just that now, rather than looking like Asian Hell's Angels, they had their own visual identity to rally around. This new gen of bikers would even differentiate themselves further by allowing women to join them. And there would even be women-only Bosozoku gangs come the 70s and 80s. But you might ask, why did so many teens and young adults join these biker gangs? Doesn't seem that terribly responsible. And you're right, but to answer that, I'm gonna have to talk about my home country for a bit.
So one piece of criticism I always get is that it's kind of weird for me to talk about Japan, even though I don't really live there. And while I've never considered myself an authority figure on this kind of stuff, I just like talking about things in anime that interest me. I've always said that there are some shared things when talking about the Asian experience. And violent delinquent motorcycle gangs is actually one of them. Here in Malaysia, we have these groups called Rempit. And unlike the Bosozoku, who by the 90s and 2000s were diminished, Rempit culture has been going strong since the 80s. And even though these two groups are separated by miles of ocean, their stories couldn't be any more similar. For example, a lot of teenage members of Bosozoku gangs came from working class families, sons of factory or construction workers, truck drivers, real blue collar stuff. And while some of these families did live in impoverished areas in Japan, being poor wasn't the only reason why these delinquent teens joined these gangs. As the Japanese author Ikuya Sato says in their book Kamikaze Biker, Parody and Anime in Affluent Japan, quote, "The overrepresentation of high school dropouts and junior high school graduates in the Bosozoku population seems then matter of taste and stake in conformity, rather than psychological strains such as inferiority complexes or frustration in academic performance." Essentially, in a heavily conformist and regimented society like Japan, being outside the system was the main allure for Bosozoku gangs. They saw themselves as the Ronin of the modern age, living by the memories of old Japan, refusing to take part in the system of the new, decadent Western Japan. And if you're a kid that's not really motivated in your studies and you don't really care about school, why not join the long coat wearing bikers doing donuts in the parking lot? And funnily enough, the Rempit in Malaysia are basically the same thing. While most Rempit do come from urban working class poor families in the big cities like Kuala Lumpur, a lot of them end up joining because of the thrill of it and the identity it gives them. Like, no joke, even though the Rempit of Malaysia aren't as gaudy as their East Asian counterparts, they do have a lot of things that are specific to them. Just like the change from the Kaminari Zoku to the Bosozoku, Rempit do have their own distinct fashion style. You'll always see them wearing oversized hoodies or jackets. They'll also always wear the tightest bootleg branded skinny jeans you can find at a Malaysian night market. They'll also always dye their hair the shade of dirty blonde, to the point where the shade of dirty blonde is associated with trashiness over here because of its association with Rempit. And they'll always have a fanny pack because most of them are smokers. Hell, they even have their own slang language. Like, the word kencing in normal Malaysian means peeing or pissing, but in Rempit slang it means lying or to lie. Don't ask me why this is the case, I also don't know. All of this is to say, humans want what they can't have. If you come from a society that prioritizes conformity, but then you see a gang of bikers living to their own creed, at their own pace, by their own collective power, it can be enticing if you didn't know any better. If you come from a background of poverty and you feel like you don't have a space in the systems that be, a group of dirty blonde-haired bikers living outside of said system could be tempting to you. Don't get me wrong, they were still violent gangs at the end of the day. I'm not trying to make a sob story. Some Bosozoku gangs would end up having ties with the Yakuza, and the Rempit here are heavily implicated with gang activity and vandalism. I'm just trying to explain that when people feel frustrated, they'll go to the first place that lets them express that frustration, irregardless of how chaotic it is. And when the energy and frustration of youth is bottled up, it tends to erupt violently at the society that surrounds it. While the Bosozoku and Rempit share the same origins of wayward teens and young adults, their endpoints couldn't be any more different. By the late 1990s, the Japanese government signed into effect the Boryakudan laws, a series of new laws and ordinances that specifically targeted organized crime. And while the Bosozoku weren't technically organized crime, like I said, they were heavily implicated with them. Some Bosozoku members did end up doing jobs for the Yakuza, like drug and gun running. It also didn't help that some Bosozoku gangs would have public turf wars that did get violent, further disrupting public peace. So in the eyes of the Japanese public and government, there was no difference between them. The lines were blurred, everyone was suspect. What also led to the decline of the Bosozoku was Japan's bursting bubble economy in the 1980s, which is now the third time I'm talking about this. If you want a full context about this event, go watch my 2 videos here, but to cut a very long story short, worsening economy leads to lower wages, and lower wages means less money to spend on hobbies because buying custom embroidered jumpsuits and modded out bikes is really, really expensive. So between this and the aforementioned police crackdowns meant that by the 2010s, there would only be around 6,000 to 7,000 recorded Bosozoku members, a sharp contrast to the 42,000 numbers of the 1980s. But where the Bosozoku were diminished, the Rempit are still going, and if anything, they've been politicized. Politicians here will flip-flop constantly on what to do about them. And one day, the government will bar them from fuel subsidies for their bikes, literally grounding them. On another day, they'll suggest building a specialized racetrack just for them to get the speed out of their system, even though we've established that part of the thrill with Rempit and Bosozoku comes from being partly illegal. And while I do sympathize with the Rempit, seeing as how a lot of them come from poor families with not a lot of opportunities open to them, the risk they represent to others as well as themselves just can't be understated. But that's where I'll leave it off for the Rempit and their antics, because you guys are here for the Bosozoku. And ironically enough, you guys have definitely seen a Bosozoku way before this video. So just like Gyaru, Bosozoku is one of the most represented subculture tropes in anime. Doesn't matter what era of anime that you started watching in, chances are you've definitely seen a Bosozoku character. Like, yeah, at the basic level you have Akira, which is steeped in that early Japanese motorcycle culture. It's also not unreasonable for me to say that since the movie came out in 1988, which was around the peak of the Bosozoku movement, the director and creator of Akira, Katsuhiro Otomo, probably did take some inspiration from the few gangs that he saw himself. But then you get to the smaller titles that are equally authentic in showing Bosozoku. For example, the anime Tokyo Revengers, one of the most popular anime of the 2021 spring lineup, had a lot of people wondering on how the fuck could 14-year-old middle schoolers be involved in turf wars where they beat the ever-loving shit out of each other. But it turns out, Tokyo Revengers wasn't too far off from reality. According to Ikuya Sato's book again, most Bosozoku members did in fact range from 15 to 20 years old, with anyone older than that being forced to graduate from the gang. That's right, in the violent delinquent teen motorcycle gangs, 21 was considered too unk. And in the anime as well, most of the characters do wear the iconic tokofuku, all while riding on appropriately modded out bikes. And if you go back even further, there are plenty of 90s OVAs and mangas that were all about the Bosozoku or delinquent scene of Japan. Too many actually for me to focus on in this last part. Some notable standouts are stories like Shonen Jin Aigumi, a 90s action comedy manga that did have Bosozoku main characters, which strangely enough would get a live action adaptation in 2020. You also had representation for women with characters like Ayumi Mizuchi, which in the manga Sukeban Deka was the leader of an all-women's biker gang, directly taking inspiration from the real world's women-only Bosozoku gangs. The point is, as much as the Bosozoku were considered problematic and were seen as a societal and moral problem, fictionally, they were a phenomenon that captured a lot of people's imaginations. They were a peek into a world that existed outside the system, and because they existed outside the system, authors and artists could make them into anything they wanted them to be. If they wanted a Bosozoku main character, then they could just be some misunderstood drifter type who's trying to make up for his gruff and violent past. If they wanted a gangster type villain but didn't want to make them part of the Yakuza for some reason, then there is plenty of precedence to make them Bosozoku because of their IRL antics. It's kind of like cowboys in fiction. They were simultaneously the honorable Lone Ranger wandering from town to town, trying to help the small folk wherever they could, while also being the murderous roving pack of bandits terrorizing said small folk. But I do think the tale of the Bosozoku is one that any country can relate to. Young people who couldn't find their place in the systems that be and were told to measure up to something they couldn't. Because when you strip away the noise and the moral panic, both the Bosozoku and Malaysia's Rempits are really just a product of the same story. Young people left out of the nation's idea of progress. It's a reminder that rebellion isn't about breaking the world, it's about asking if there's still a place for you in it.